5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is Chad here, and you're listening to My Alien Life.
Hello, futurelings and listeners around the world. It's Monday, April 20, 2020. Welcome to My Alien Life. Tonight, we look back at how this all started. It's my great honor to be able to bring you the stories that have shaped who we are. Together this week, we'll travel back in time to hear some of the stories that maybe you haven't heard before. These are the shows that started it all, real events that even today I find incredible. Be sure to listen Wednesday night to My Alien Life podcast. I am joined by my two best friends in a 2-hour interview that is full of foul language and inappropriate behavior, of course. I tell them about our group abduction in 1984. Jeff and Mark both remember our adventure that night with one important detail omitted: how and when they got home. You've heard this story. Now you get to hear all about what really happened that night when a flat tire literally transported them through what would be the most extraordinary adventures of their lives. That and more is coming up on My Alien Life. My Alien Life is recorded live from atop the Northern Rocky Mountains and is available on Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, and everywhere fine podcasts are found. My website is at www.myalienlifepodcast.com. There you will find my email address, all previously recorded shows, and more. I am Cameron Brower. This is My Alien Life, and the podcast starts right now.
My Alien Life Podcast.
Three, two, 1, 0, and liftoff.
This show has been edited and remixed, and it aired on March 1st, 2019. It's called Run. Since that day 1 year ago, we have had many amazing guests and so many incredible listeners from around the world. Tonight, revisit the episode that sees a friend and myself outrun and possibly outwit our extraterrestrial foes. Thank you so much for listening to My Alien Life. Tonight, I want us to look into what it's like to have an ET or extraterrestrial or alien encounter that you can't remember. I've talked a little bit about that in the last few podcasts, but we're going to get deeper and deeper into this one. And so there's lots of interesting stories and things that have happened to me in my lifetime, and basically here to share them with you. I find it fascinating and amazing that we can experience missing time or gaps in time that we can't account for. We hear lots of stories. You can look on the internet and read all kinds of stories, and here on YouTube and places like that, such great resources. We can find out about people that have had those experiences. For me, this was and is the most common experience I had in my alien life. This was something I learned to live with, and after 20 years or so, it didn't make me as anxious because I would come away with it, or come away from a missing period of time, perfectly healthy. And if I just let my mind go and accept the phenomenon that I experienced, I do believe I gained a little more insight on what circumstances led me there, and a little more insight on what was actually happening. Then again, there were so many things that I didn't understand, but after a long time, I just was able to kind of put some of that fear to rest, and I felt a lot better about my situation. Yeah, I said 20 years, and that's a long time to go missing. I can't even guess how many times this happened. I don't really think it happened more than maybe 5 times a year, and I'm thinking it probably happened without my knowledge many times. It still may, I don't know, but especially before I hit puberty, it was scary at first first. And I sort of talked about that on my tonsillectomy top podcast, and I just came to the conclusion that I was gone for a little while during those same 24 hours during my tonsillectomy and my visit to the hospital. I described that as a dream, but I definitely was somewhere else for a while, and I think that would be easy for me as a little kid to confuse with dreaming or something not real, believing something that's not real. And it explains why I have, two memories of the same event. And as a kid it was terrorizing and not good. I think about that, and it still makes me a little anxious to think about that when I was a little kid, and it was so long ago. Our human minds are creative, and we come up with ideas that make reality even more terrifying. As a mechanism of survival, it's understandable because it produces a lot of adrenaline. You're ready to fly or fight if you have to. I think as adults, we learn to avoid situations that put us in danger. We're able to rationalize fear and use our own adrenaline only in extreme emergencies, and when we also have the ability to call for help if we need it as adults. So adrenaline is important, but when we're adults, we understand how we can get help, and some of those feelings that we had as kids aren't as extreme now as they are when we're adults. So there were some times when I suddenly found myself somewhere else in my past, and sometimes I was somewhere else or sometime else, or both. There was times that all of a sudden I was somewhere else, and other times I was some other when. I would basically come to the realization that time escaped me, and I was in the future, quite a ways in the future, hours at times, and it's kind of confusing. But there were so many times early on in that 20 years where I started, definitely coping and building walls, because I've heard people use walls as a coping tool, but for me, coping meant surviving. So it was a survival tool, and I understand how somebody can use the mental technique of building walls to help their survival. I internalized all of it because if I let that fear take me over, I would have probably done a whole lot of damage to my family, and I really don't think that they could have handled it that well. There was just a lot of fear there, and a lot of fear you don't know what to do with. I saw this happening to my brother when he was around 12 years old. When I was around 12, he started screaming. There'd be a lot of screaming at night for no reason. Sometimes he was screaming that they're going to get me. They're going to get me. And again, I was like 12, and he was just a little kid, and that screaming and listening to what he was screaming scared me even more. And the more that happened, the more I drifted away from him. Not because I didn't want to protect him. I would have, when I was growing up, I would crush anyone who tried to harm him, and I did. I was a bigger kid, so I was always standing up for my brother when kids were picking on him. But I couldn't protect him from the same things that I was going through, and that's why I was putting distance between he and I. This type of organism that I dealt with all the time had no vulnerability that I knew of. If you were humid, you would just have to put up with it and put up with whatever they threw at you. So build walls and wait it out, hoping they'd finish one day and you'd never have to experience that kind of fear again. And it was awful to see somebody else in my family experiencing that, of which I could only assume was some of the same things I was going through, but I'm not sure. I've never talked about any of this with anyone else. This is the first time anybody's hearing this, so one day maybe he and I can compare notes. Long time ago, I remember one very, very warm day in November when I was 10 years old. And it was a day of fear. And again, a day of fear that I never want to experience again. This part of Montana could be very warm in November. Sometimes it could get up to 65 degrees. That wasn't unheard of. And on that particular day when I was just 10 years old, I was exploring the prairie. And I was out there. I remember this vividly, wearing only jeans, and I had this T-shirt that I always wore, and it was just gray. And I loved that T-shirt. I was wearing blue jeans and that T-shirt, and I was outside, and I started walking. Wasn't uncommon for me to walk 4 or 5 miles and then turn around and walk home. And you add a couple of miles and wandering back and forth and exploring out there. And it was a very, very long walk for a kid that was 10 years old. Lots of things to see out there in the Montana prairie. We had fossil beds that I would spend half my childhood digging through. There are fossil layers of fossils that I would dig through. And my bedroom usually had fossilized snails, clams, and tube worms, and even fossilized bone that filled boxes under my bed, and shelves in my room, and lots of corners in my room. And there were teepee rings from native Indian tribes that could be found in the area, which was abundant in game, still is. 150 years ago, I'm sure it was as well. Lewis and Clark reported being near that area, and they reported grizzly bears in the area during their journey of discovery. And kind of makes me wonder what they ran into out there. It could have been pretty amazing if they would have run into some of the same things that I run into out in the Montana prairie. But I said teepee rings. There are a lot of teepee rings, a lot of activity from Native American tribes in that area. If you're not hip with the term teepee rings, they are the circular patterns of stones that were left from an encampment, usually historic or proto-historic or post-archaic Indians. They are found primarily in the plains of the United States and Canada, and also in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. They had clusters of stone circles that are often found in favorable areas where they could camp, especially areas sometimes higher up that were flat and near water and fuel and great hunting grounds. In many cases, the clusters are organized in patterns such as rows or circles or V-shape. The stones were used to hold down the teepees to keep the lodge warm and dry. And I'm stealing a Wikipedia definition again, because some people, they diss others. You hear, I've been listening to a podcast today, and they were dissing each other for using Wikipedia and quoting Wikipedia, which I don't get, because I don't know a single person who can rattle off definitions from memory, and someone always benefits from these little lessons. But the thing is that people expect perfection. If they listen to a podcast, and they really notice the mistakes, but so, there's nothing wrong with looking things up online and quoting it, as long as you let everybody know that it's from Wikipedia. But back in the day, everyone had a dictionary, when I was young, and we all felt smart. And, if somebody asked us a question, we'd be smart, Alex, and tell them to look it up, which was kind of dissing the person who asked the question. But we had no problem when someone looked up something and recited a definition, when we had our own dictionary back then. Everybody had their own dictionary back in high school and grade school, and there's nothing wrong with somebody looking something up. But that whole area that I grew up in was rich in prehistory, and it's no wonder I grew up and wanted to pursue a career in archaeology. So, but yeah, I was walking on the prairie, and on this particular day, it was my birthday, and I was 10 years old, And I probably left, I remember leaving a little bit. I was probably early, about 9 a.m., and I usually didn't get out of the house until 9 a.m., but I remember it being too cold to wear a t-shirt, which I had on, and I was walking, and in like 30 minutes or so, I worked up a good sweat. And I remember not being excited about my birthday, because I was never excited about my birthday. Even back then, I'm still not excited about my birthday. My birthday indifference didn't matter because, I always had something to do, or something I wanted to do, and that was going hiking for the day. Even though knowing I was going to have a party in the afternoon, a birthday party, it didn't stop me from hiking. So I call it hiking now because it gives my walks in the prairie more purpose, and it elevates that purpose from playing to being on an adventure. And this time, my mom didn't say, "Why don't you go outside and play in the prairie?" which in itself was kind of a punishment for being too noisy inside or being a pest in the house. But I loved the prairie, and it was always calling me for adventure in one way or another. And it was the another part I dreaded when I was out there, but not enough to keep me home. So I started walking and maybe went a half a mile and was finally breaking a little sweat, and the sun was bright and it was getting warm, which it can do in that part of Montana. It can be cold that time of year too, but we get breaks, and we get weeks of warmer weather and colder weather, and it's very hospitable, but it's beautiful. And after about an hour of walking and poking around, I topped a long flat hill and was looking at my first set of teepee rings that day. And it's a place I'd been to a lot. I've been there many, many times. So, but it was a neat spot, just an amazing spot. The view was amazing, and I would explore these teepee rings. And if I think about it now, it's like, wow, how amazing that I was just standing there at this Indian camp from who knows how far back in history. I mean, just the fact that it was still visible, it probably wasn't that old, maybe 150 years. I just stand there and take it all in and imagine what would happen there hundreds of millions of years ago, because of the fossil record that was so close by there. And this time, standing on the hill was a little bit different. I grew up in a windy place, and there was no wind that day. It was always present in that part of Montana, but not that day. And though I could feel the air outside press against my body, it was a calm day. But it's this pressure, this familiar pressure that I could feel around my body. I could feel this, and it was growing. And I just started to feel different, almost like maybe there was a little electrical charge in the air, but the air around me felt more and more comfortable. It was pressing against me. And then there was a hum. And I'm sure this is one of the first times I remember this hum. I'm not exactly sure if it's the absolute first time, and it sounded familiar. I remember it sounding familiar, but this is one of the times that I can remember it in detail. And I'm an avid guitarist now, and I have been for a while, and I mess around on the piano. And about the age of 25, that hum never went away. I could hear it. I can hear it now, but when I was at like 25 years old, I started to think about it. And like I said, I play guitar. One day I was on the piano, and that hum is a low F sharp. I've only heard that hum a couple of times since college, but it's always the same hum. It came from everywhere. When I was standing up on that hill, it was just everywhere. Make no mistake about it. Every direction, including overhead and underground, at different angles. It's just it's humming, and it wasn't loud enough to be painful, but the fact that you couldn't escape it was terrifying. Growing up within 100 miles of an Air Force base, you saw a lot of big planes, you heard a lot of big planes, and this wasn't the same bird, no. You could feel that sound in every part of your body. The hum never changed. It was the same volume, and it never changed direction while I was standing there. If there was the slightest change, you could probably tolerate it because you expect a change in pitch or direction. I'm standing there, and I expected a change, but it didn't change, nothing. just a loud hum and a feeling of all the air around you pressing against you, and now even harder because the sound was so hard to explain, but it just touched every part of your body, and it was in your bones. And it gave me the sensation rather that I was getting smaller or the prairie was getting bigger. All the sound pressing against me, the air pressing against me, the temperature was perfect. It wasn't hot, it wasn't cold, it was just right. And it gave me that feeling that maybe there wasn't any temperature at all, that it wasn't even a relative thing anymore. It was maybe there was no temperature. There was my body, yeah, but the air around me had no temperature. The sound so terrifying that it made my body still comfortable, but it also made me feel immobile. And I didn't care about the immobility. I just wanted the sound to stop, and it did. Just when I thought it would last forever, it stopped. And then I could feel the cool prairie air again, much cooler than when I got there, for sure, and confusing at that time. I think about it right now, I can feel that. I can feel, all of a sudden, I can feel the cool air again when everything felt comfortable on my body. And the other thing I could feel was the sun was on the right side of my face, which was on the wrong side of my face. Instead of being right in my face, it was to the right side of my face. And I know when I was on top of the hill initially, I was looking out, and I could look out directly at the sun. Now it was right on the right side of my face, and I hadn't moved, I hadn't turned around. So at that particular time, I knew it had to be sometime in the afternoon, hours after I stepped on top of the hill, but I didn't know how that could be. And so it was startling, and I started running, and I ran. I probably ran for an hour, not very fast. It's more like jogging. I wasn't a fast runner. I'd walk a little bit, then I'd run. I knew my mom would be worried if I didn't walk into the house soon. So I ran, and I got close to my house, and I walked a little bit and ran up to my yard and walked across the yard and opened the door of the house, and which opened in a little area that was really close to our dining room, and I could see 5 kids at our dining room table. My mom said, "Did you forget it was your birthday?" And I said, "No." And she said, "We were about ready to cut the cake." And I was speechless. I remember feeling embarrassed, but again, I was still feeling the effects of the hum. My whole body was tingling. My ears were still ringing. And I just sat there for close to an hour, and I looked at the kids. I wanted to run into my bedroom and crawl under the covers and hide and just be away from people, but I just sat there. And the cake. So I ate cake, and that was a temporary cure. And I could still taste that cake. That day, it was probably the best cake I had ever had. And that sugar woke me up. And I really, at that point, needed sugar. I felt so depleted. And the more cake I ate and the more red Kool-Aid I drank, the better I felt. It was amazing. At that hour later that I was at the house, I just felt like I couldn't get enough sugar. And I remember that sugar taste. I could taste sugar in the cake. I could taste sugar in the Kool-Aid. And to this day, I love sugar. And not like I did back then. And I don't need sugar now like I did back then. But sugar was one of those things that after an event like that, whatever it was, I have my theory. And we'll talk about that on another episode. But I just felt like I needed sugar, and that was the only thing that made me feel halfway normal. I still loved roaming the prairie. I did it a lot, and there was other times I was out there by myself, and where I'd come home and there would be gaps in time. Sometimes they were very short, sometimes they were longer. I don't think they ever exceeded 5 or 6 hours, but yeah. They weren't infrequent. They happened on a regular basis, and I never stopped loving going out there. I think a person can get used to just about anything. That was hard for me to get used to, but 2 years later, I think I was about 12, and I was out there, and on a day that felt a lot like my 10th birthday, but I think it was about the middle of the summer. It wasn't too hot outside. I took 2 friends with me, and we hiked 5 miles or so to the northwest, and we explored, we joked, we were having a great time. For some reason, I thought about that first time that I heard that hum on my 10th birthday, and I was feeling anxious because I should have been in trouble, but that day, but I wasn't. I guess it was because it was my birthday, and that day, 2 friends were with me, and they were my best friends. And on this day, they would share another harrowing adventure on the prairie that involved missing time and, who knows, maybe contact with creatures that I call IMOs. I'm absolutely sure they don't remember like I do, and I've never asked them if they recall these adventures like I do. And they were out there with me more than once, but today we were a group of 3, and it was an amazing day. Good times with friends. And when the sun was on our right side a little as we were walking, we knew it was time to go home. And that afternoon we were having such a good time. And we walked about a mile toward home, and we were quite a ways out there, and we stopped, and we stopped at the same time for no reason. I mean, we absolutely just stopped, and nobody said a word, and we just stared at each other. We were kind of in a little triangle looking at each other, and my 2 friends were looking at me, and I was kind of looking back and forth at them, and we may have sat there or stood there for approximately a minute, and then their mouths opened slightly, and I thought, I'm looking at them, and we're about to speak, or they were about to speak, and their mouths opened just slightly, and then I felt that pressure in my ears, and I felt warm air pressing into my skin, really deep into my skin. Run. I yelled it. Run. I yelled it, and they didn't move. Run. I yelled it louder and pushed them both backwards, and we all ran. My friend Scotty screamed, and I almost laughed because he had no idea why he was screaming or why we were running. He always frightened easy, and then the hum started, exactly as I remembered it, in volume, direction, and with no changes in pitch or volume. The sound by that time in our bone was deep in our bones. We could feel that, or I could feel that air pressing into my skin. Effing run. I yelled so loud. When we got home later, my throat was still stinging, but I yelled louder that day than I had ever yelled in my life. And after running 5 minutes, we were totally out of breath. We knew we were going to have to stop, and we started to slow down at the same time at the edge of a wheat field, and we started walking fast, kind of through the wheat, kind of high stepping, and then we came to a strip of plowed field, and we ran harder, and then to another wheat field, and we walked again. The hum didn't change. We never looked at each other, and we never spoke to each other. All we knew at that moment was to run, and when we got to those open fields of plowed earth, we ran. We walked, alternating between wheat and plowed, and then came to the last mile or so before we got to my house, and the hum stopped. And it stopped just as fast as it started, and we started walking. And we walked, and we were all silent. We didn't say a word to each other. We were within, a visible. My house was in the distance, not too far away, and we could see my house. And after 2 minutes or so just walking, Scotty said to me, "You're sweaty." I said, "Yeah, I know." And then Scotty said something about his sister had friends over, something like that, and he was wondering if he could go to my house. I said that was cool. And then he said, I'll never forget this part. He said, "We should stay out here longer." I told him I was tired and we should go to my house and eat. And he just said, why? We just got here. And yeah, I mean, that was a moment. It took me by surprise, and I just sat really still for a minute and thought about that. And so we walked around a bit and stayed out on the prairie about another hour or so. And when every fiber of my body, I just wanted to crawl into bed again. Had that same feeling I did on my 10th birthday, and I wanted to sleep this one off. And we walked into my house and we sat down in the living room, and we had a big old wooden coffee table in there, and all three of us just sat there and we ate a whole box of saltines and a big pitcher of Kool-Aid between the three of us. We never talked about that day. We talked about lots of other days on the prairie, and we still do. And we had a blast out there. But that was one day that we've never talked about. And I always wonder. I still wonder what we would say to each other if we talked about that day.
My Alien Life Podcast.
You can find my website at www.myalienlifepodcast.com, and please subscribe to my latest downloads at iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and at podbean.com. And please follow me and like me on Facebook and Twitter. My Alien Life is written and produced for broadcast at Studio 254 in the Northern Rocky Mountains. The music you are hearing is produced and created by Elion. You can find all Elion's work online at Heart Dance Records.